Okay, well, science was my base, and I did little things like I designed my first Boolean algebra, or I built my first Boolean algebra machine when I was 12. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair prizes when I was 12. My mom trotted me off to the University of Buffalo when I was 12 to sit down for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department, not the undergraduate physics department, the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo. It was probably supposed to be a courtesy visit because, after all, my mom must have pulled a lot of strings. What head of a graduate department wants to meet with a 12-year-old? And the meeting lasted an hour. And it lasted an hour because the hottest topic of the day was in cosmology. It was steady state theory versus Big Bang theory. And we were discussing the Doppler shift and Big Bang theory versus steady state theory. And I mean, as I said, it was the hot topic of the day. So we just went on and on and on about it. Then when I was 16, I got to work at the world's largest cancer research facility. So I spent my youth in science, my teenage years. Teenagers didn't want to have me as part of their culture. Fine. I was still in with Galileo and von Leeuwenhoek, those who had followed them. So when I finally got to college, well, first of all, another thing happened when I was 12. I didn't realize, and I don't know if anybody else watching this will have this problem. I didn't realize it, but nobody actually ever looked at me. In school, other kids did not make eye contact, not at all. And one day in 8th grade, a girl who I thought loathed me swiveled her eyes and actually made eye contact. And it was a little bit shocking because it had never happened before. And she then opened her mouth, which was even more shocking. And she said, "I told my mom that you understand the theory of relativity." Well, the only thing I had going for me was my reputation for having a brain. When I was 11, the kids decided to call me the sickly scientist. It was some form of attention and acknowledgement, after all, and I couldn't admit that I didn't know the theory of relativity. So I got on my bicycle as soon as school got out, and I went down to the library where the librarians knew me better than my parents did, and rushed in. And by then they'd gotten used to the fact that we don't limit him to the kids section, let him read everything in the adult section. And I said, "Give me everything you got on relativity." So they gave me a great big fat book and a little tiny skinny book. And the great big fat book was the first one that I tackled, and it was all equations. There were only 2 sentences on a 2-page spread, and the rest was all equations. I have no clue to equations. I still don't have a clue when it comes to equations. So at any rate, I got through about 50 pages of that book, and then 8 o'clock rolled around. Because one of the things I learned is, even if you're reading something you don't think you understand a word of, if you go all the way to the end, by the time you're finished, you have a sense of what the thing was about. So, but it was 8 o'clock. My parents were going to put me to sleep in 2 hours. I had to understand the theory of relativity by the next morning. So I turned to the little skinny book, the first book was by Einstein and some collaborators. The second book was just by Einstein. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but sometimes a writer seems to reach out through the pages and grab you by the lapel and put your nose up to his and give you a personal message. Okay, Einstein grabbed me by the lapels through the introduction to this book, and he basically said this: "Schmuck. If you want to be a genius, it's not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. You have to be able to come up with that theory. Then you have to be able to explain it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it." In other words, Einstein said, to be a scientific thinker, you are going to have to be a writer. So when I was 16, I got obsessed with writing. And after dropping out of school and hitchhiking and riding the rails and developing a group of accidental followers and accidentally helped start a movement that wouldn't get a name for another year, was eventually called the hippie movement, I came back to school. And because I'd spent my whole life in science, that's the way it seemed anyway, I didn't major in science. That didn't seem necessary. I majored in English literature, hoping they would teach me how to write. And I minored in psychology because psychology is at the root of all of these forms of mass emotion that the gods are involved with. The gods, in my opinion, are involved with the kinds of mass passions that make history. Adolf Hitler was able to accomplish everything he accomplished because he was a brilliant manipulator, or it's not exactly the right word, he was a brilliant igniter of ecstatic passions, of the kind of passions that make us feel we've risen above ourselves and become part of something so much larger than ourselves that it gives us a majesty we would never have